Hello and welcome to another PH video blog. Now this one is a bit different because the Jaguar F-Type Coupe you see behind me is mine. Well, it's not actually mine, it does still belong to Jaguar, but it will be my car for the next 6 months. I'll be spending quite a lot of time in it, and Jaguar were very kind and let me spec it from the ground up. So they let me choose the spec, the colour and everything else. I asked the colour. Now you'll be noticing the Firesand orange is quite attention seeking. My original thought was to go for something a little bit more subdued, maybe a dark metallic grey or a British racing green, something a bit more traditionally Jaguar, but I was stupid enough to put it to a vote in the office and everyone went, nah, have the Firesand. So Firesand it is. Now I have to confess, in low light it does look a little bit, whisper it, brown, but in bright sunshine it does really pop and look absolutely spectacular. So we'll have to see whether the novelty wears off as we go along. Let me talk you around some of the other bits and bobs that I've fitted to the car in the configurator. Now I thought the black wheels against the Firesand would look pretty good, so I've gone for the 20-inch wheel option up from 19s as standard. I've got the standard high performance brakes. There is a super performance option with a bigger rear disc, but I did splash out on some black calipers again to set it against the Firesand orange. I did splash out somewhat on a carbon fibre roof, probably not a huge amount of functional advantage in that, but I just like the look of it. Now then, this is the controversial bit, the chrome window surrounds. I have to confess, when the car turned up, I thought, oh, gold. And then when, a few weeks ago, I was with Ian Callum, head of Jaguar Design, and I mentioned that I had this F-Type Coupe just delivered. He said, oh yeah, what colour? And I said, Firesand. And he went, oh, well, you did spec the black pack, didn't you? And I had to say, no, I didn't, actually. I think, with hindsight, it would have looked a lot better against the Firesand paint than the chrome does. We're looking into if we can get this addressed or not. Now, Ian, as an old hot rodder, had a bit of a ghetto solution of running black insulation tape around it. That was what he used to do with it back in the day. Maybe it'll come to that. Maybe we'll be able to find a more permanent solution. We'll investigate that down the line. Now then, being a V6, I get the nice central exhaust, which I think I prefer, the kind of E-type reference there, also in the lights as well. I think I prefer the look of the V6 Coupe over the V8, which has the quad exhaust, of course. There's another reason, but we'll get to that in a minute. Being a coupe, it's actually got a decent boot as well, which is not something you get on the convertible, of course, with its suitcase-sized compartment. Now then, if we get inside, I can tell you about the most important thing that I chose for this car. In my opinion anyway, and that is, yes, it's a manual. That was really one of the reasons why we went for a V6 and not a V8, because this is the most powerful F-Type you can get with a manual gearbox, 380 horsepower, and it's combined with this traditional transmission. It's got a mechanical limited slip diff at the back, so hopefully this is the kind of old school traditionalist spec of F-Type. What else did I choose? Well, normally this would be the name and shame where we poke a bit of fun at all the ridiculous options that the press office have added. In this instance, I've only got myself to blame because I chose everything on this car, didn't I? So, starting price, £60,775. That's pretty hefty, I've got to say. To that, we have added the Firesand orange paint at £715. Got jet leather and Firesand stitching to match the paint, that's no cost. We've got an aluminium dark hex centre console, again no cost. Those 20-inch wheels, £1,785. High performance braking system black calipers, £310. Visibility pack, £1,100. That's the demisting windscreen, things like that. Premium leather with performance seats, £2,495. Bit of an extravagance, but they are very nice indeed. Parking pack, now we need that because you can't really see very much out of this car. That gives you parking radar and a reversing camera as well. Illuminated metal tread plates with Jaguar script. Now, I don't actually remember speccing those, but they're on the car and they cost £255. Meridian digital surround sound system, splashed out on that as well, virtually, and that wasn't my money of course, but I do spend quite a lot of time on the road, so I wanted a nice stereo. And finally that carbon roof at £2,550. Grand total for that lot, £71,880. Cripes, that is quite a lot of money. That's kind of, well, it's not far off what my spec'd out BMW M4 long-term cost. It's not a million miles away from a Nissan GTR, if you stretch that a bit. It's cheaper than a basic 911, but it is quite a lot of money. I have to confess, rather more than I had intended to spend, even though, as we say, it wasn't actually my money. Right, so here I am in the driving seat of my very own Jaguar, almost, or as close as I'll get for the time being. What are my first impressions? Well, we're still kind of in the honeymoon phase at the moment, I would say. The new car smell is just about faded. I put a few hundred miles in, basically mainly schlepping up and down the M1, just kind of getting a feel for the car. Now, I've talked you through the kind of specs and the options and the things like that, but really we want to talk about the motivations for choosing a V6S, and particularly a coupe F-Type, and particularly one with a manual gearbox. Now, I think the reason this car appealed to me was that it is quite an old-fashioned combination of bits. Supercharging is quite old school, manual gearbox obviously, mechanical limited slip differential at the back. It's all wrapped up in very kind of modern day Jaguar stuff, so it's got aluminium construction. It's not particularly light, as has been commented on many times. As part of the S-Spec you get the adaptive dampers. That's about the only real kind of electronic thing about this car. It's all, I know people go on about digital and analog cars. This is not an analog car, but in this kind of day and age it's probably as close to that as you can get, and very different from the kind of equivalent cars you might be able to buy. What would those be? Well, I guess I've done a blog about this already, so I don't want to slavishly compare it to Porsches, but I guess it might be an alternative to a very, very well-spec'd Cayman, or an absolutely entry-level 911 Carrera, but that's still a 76 grand car with absolutely no options on it whatsoever, and this is 72 with a fairly hefty array of bits and bobs on it, so it doesn't really go up against any Porsches directly, and I don't think it does in character either, so let's park that particular comparison. We'll get back to what else you can possibly have for this money as we go on, but let's just have a look at the way it drives. The engine is very nice indeed. I like it. It's got a great noise. I'll give you a bit more of that in a bit. It's nice and smooth. It pulls well. It's got just a nice level of performance. The V8s are kind of quite overwhelming in the way they deliver their power, literally in the case of the traction from the rear axle sometimes, but this V6 seems to have just a nice balance, and with the supercharger it's got a nice linear power delivery as well, not the kind of whoosh bang that you get in a lot of turbos, so that's good. The rear wheel drive balance, I've not been feeling a huge amount of that so far. I haven't been pushing it that hard, to be honest. Well, let me just switch to my dynamic mode and maybe show you a little bit more about how it affects the way this car drives. Now, straight away, dynamic mode is about one of the only ways you can fiddle around with this car. There's a wet mode as well, which is quite good for driving along the motorways, as it turns out, if you just want to mooch along and not make a huge amount of fuss and bother. But dynamic mode is configurable, so you can go deep into the menus and fiddle around and set it up, so you can isolate the suspension, you can keep it on the standard suspension if you prefer. I've gone for the standard steering, dynamic dampers, and the louder engine, and it really is quite loud, I have to say, in dynamic mode. There is an exhaust override button, and that opens things up a bit, but in this mode it really does get quite leery, but that's always been an F-Type thing, hasn't it? Quite like that. I think it's probably just the right side of antisocial. We'll have to see if my neighbours agree. After the Range Rover SVR they may be slightly less generously inclined, but we shall find out. But the manual, it is, first impressions, I have to confess, not quite as delightful as I perhaps hoped for. Now, it's got quite a lot of travel in the lever, this gearbox. It's not one of the most pleasant manuals I've ever used. Slightly rubbery feel to the action as well, which kind of seemed a little bit familiar to me. Feels a bit like the gearboxes found in some modern BMWs, and I did some routing around, and turns out this is a ZF 6-speed gearbox, which is, from what I can tell, I think the same as what BMW fits to cars like the M2 and the manual versions of the M3 and M4. And although it's lovely having a manual, those gearboxes have never quite felt quite as sharp as you'd have hoped, and it's the same in this case. It's not helped by the fact that the clutch pedal's got quite a lot of travel and it doesn't bite until you get right to the top, so it's not, as you can see, I fumbled that one there, it's not quite as kind of instinctive or quick to use as you might hope. I'm getting used to it, and I think it works better in dynamic mode because the throttle response is a bit sharper, so the engine is a bit more responsive to the kind of blips and things like that that you might want to throw in, which are really kind of part of the whole manual experience, aren't they? You want to be able to enjoy all those slightly theatrical touches and, you know, choosing when to hold a gear, when to shift down and all that kind of thing. It's all part of the fun. So I want to like this transmission, and I'm kind of willing to work with it, but it's perhaps not quite what I was hoping it might be from first impressions. We'll see how that goes with a few more miles down the way and some harder driven miles as well. The rest of the package feels really nice, I've got to say. This being a later F-Type, it has the electric power steering, which is, I have to say, probably one of the better systems around. It still feels a little bit synthetic in its weighting, but it's pretty damn good, I've got to say. It's got a lightness about it, but it's also very positive, and they even get, dare I say it, a little bit of feedback, just a little bit of murmur as you go over the bumps and things like that. That's quite unusual in this day and age as well. Again, kind of playing to this car's old school vibes, part of the reason I wanted to get one in and have a go. The ride is, I think maybe there is a slight lack of suspension travel, and it can get a little bit unruly when it gets really, really bumpy, but the damping is really good. I actually prefer it against my instincts. I usually leave things in comfort damping on the road, but it actually seems more settled in dynamic, and it felt a little brittle to begin with, but I'm kind of getting used to it, and again I think it's kind of appropriate to the car's character, and in the true Jaguar fashion it's got that real sense of flow, which is very enjoyable. And as you can just tell, the noise of it's just always there, and I think it's a really authentic noise. I think the V8 is really nice, but it's quite a savage sound. It's got a kind of a hard edge to it. This V6 sounds to me much more authentic. It sounds more like an E-Type perhaps, so perhaps more in keeping with the whole retro Jag theme. So it's slightly less rampant in the power delivery than the V8, so there's not quite that same sense of constantly living on the edge of oversteer, at least in the drive. We'll have to see what it's like when we drive it in the wet. It's not actually rained in the time that I've had it yet, incredibly enough, so we'll have to see what happens there. So a lot of people who've driven all the different types of F-Types seem to think that the V6 is actually a nicer balanced package, and I think because of things like that, because it feels slightly less unhinged day to day, it's actually perhaps the nicer all-round car. So be interested to find out if that translates once I've got a few more miles under my belt. So now we've picked up the pace a bit, we're on a back road, and it all is gelling together rather nicely. I've got to say, for all the weight, you don't really notice it feeling too hefty at all. If and when I get it onto a track, we'll have to see if that translates then. I suspect it may start to show a few of those excess pounds at that point, but we'll have to find out. As you can probably tell, I'm rather favourably disposed to this car. It's just a nice place to be. Like all Jaguars, it's just got loads of charisma. It's a comfortable place to be. It's refined. It looks beautiful, I think, and people absolutely love it as well. The interior is generally good. Driving position's great. I like the style of the interior. There's a few slightly cheaper fixtures and fittings which are perhaps a little bit disappointing compared with some of the competition, but the nav in particular looks a little bit outdated compared with what you get on some of the rival products, but overall I think it's a nice place to spend time, and that's a good thing because I'm going to be here for the next 6 months. First impressions then, pretty damn good. I will be reporting back in as we go along to see how that develops.